Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all this morning. I was reminded this morning that I should ask you all to silence your phones. We've had a number of people say, why do phones keep ringing? And so here's my friendly reminder to reach down in your bag and silence your phones. Someone said people should silence their phones and pagers. And I said, pagers? Do we have drug dealers coming to Bible study? Probably not. Very glad to see you all this morning. Just a quick note that today is one of the handful of days when the women of St. Michael are having a luncheon. And so we'll end about 15 minutes early. We'll probably do 45 minutes today. So any of you who would like to go to the luncheon can go ahead and move on over. And it is in the church today. And it's going to be a good one. Even if you didn't RSVP, you may want to stay. It's the Satellite Sisters. It's good stuff. And so we hope that you will join us for that. And for those of you online and in person, know that we want questions. We are in chapter 12 today. We're actually not even going to finish the entire chapter because we're talking about the Passover today. And it is a big idea. And so I want us to bring to bear some questions about Passover. And it doesn't even have to be specifically about chapter 12, but what Passover means, questions you may have had, if you've got friends who are Jewish, if you have gone to Passover or Seder meals in the past, whatever you would like to have today, I want to encourage you to ask here and online. Let's start with our prayer, and we'll get rolling. The Lord be with you. And also with you. Let us pray. God, we give you thanks for bringing us together on this day, and we ask your blessing upon us. Help to make space inside of us. Free up our hearts and our minds from whatever we carried in so that your Spirit may fill us up. Help us to find peace as we study your word. Help us to be inspired by the work that you have done through faithful people throughout time, that we can become those faithful people today and help to build your kingdom here on earth. Lord, as we have spent these last few days remembering the saints of the past, those we love and see no longer, be with those in our community who need your healing touch today. Lift them up with your Spirit. Surround them with your presence. And bless all those who care for them. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, gang. We've got two sections today. The first, we're going to be talking about the first Passover, really looking at chapter 12. The second is going to be talking about Passover's impact over time, kind of placing Passover in history and in context, and the way that the idea of the Passover has really impacted both Judaism and Christianity over time. So let's jump right in. Chapter 12, we're going to start with verse 3. I'm going to read this entire, about, 10 verses, so we can get the entire picture. Chapter 12, verse 3. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire, with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. This is how you shall eat it: with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. Where I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. And we'll pause there. Let's start with the word Passover. Interestingly, I hope you all, do realize this was not written in English, right? So the idea of Passover is a great word in English that actually explains what is literally happening with the angel that passes over Egypt for this 10th plague. Do remember, this is setting us up for the 10th plague. We're going to hit that next week. That 10th plague is the tragedy. It is where innocents die. We heard both humans and animals. And what God is doing right now in a very explicit way is saying to the Israelites, you will be passed over if you reciprocate the choice I have made in you. This is very important. We've talked multiple times about the covenantal theology and how it has developed over time. We began with the garden, a nice simple gift to humanity. We messed it up. Then we had the flood. And there was that nice one-way covenant with Noah. The rainbow went into the sky. God made a promise never again to destroy the earth that way. Humans were not asked to do anything. Then we get covenant, in a sense, number 3, with Abraham. And there was a pretty small, very specific ask, which was simply a mark of male circumcision. So God chose the Israelite people and said, just choose me back by doing this very small thing. Now we get to what will become the Mosaic covenant. There's a lot more that goes into that. We've got to get to Sinai and the commandments and all those good things. But the covenant is remade beginning right here. The people are asked to simply acknowledge God's choice, acknowledge God's preference, acknowledge God's protection by slaughtering a lamb or a goat, by putting the blood over their lintel, and then by eating a particular way. All of that is, to be honest, relatively simple, right? So someone says, the firstborn of your household will die unless you do these things. You think, okay, I'm in, right? Little bloods, and who doesn't want lamb for dinner? So all of that is pretty simple. But it is important for us in the development of our relationship with God to note that more and more is being asked of us. This moment is setting up what will become the defining anchor of Jewish practice, this Passover meal. The word that we see in Hebrew is Pesach. It's translated as Passover, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But that Pesach really means he skipped us or he passed over. It might also mean something to do with a harvest, something to do actually with the lamb or the goat that is being sacrificed. It's a strange word that is kind of unique to this moment. And so to say it's literally translated in one particular way is a little bit strong. It's a word that we've landed with Passover, but it's got a meaning that hits a lot when you look at the word etymologically. And so I simply note that because we're beginning something new. It's not as if this existed in the past. This is something brand new for the Jewish people. As we set up the 10th plague, the Israelites are responding to God's choice in a very real way. The response to the choice is not just the dinner, but the way that they actually share that dinner. Look at verse 11. It's a very interesting verse. This is how you shall eat the dinner. Eat the lamb or the goat. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. That's not a general instruction. That's very specific. If we are not aware of what it means to gird loins, then let me explain. At this point in time in the ancient world, we did not really have fitted garments. Instead, essentially what would happen is people would wear robes. And robes were easy. They, one size fits all sort of thing. And what would happen when it was time to take action, which was often on the battlefield. But if you had to kind of get somewhere fast, we all understand if you're wearing a big robe, you're not probably running very efficiently across the ground. So people would gird their loins. What that means is they would essentially tuck in their robes and get the robes out of the way of their legs. That was intentional to give you more flexibility to move well. Whether that's running, whether that's fighting, you name it. To gird your loins means you're kind of getting ready, right? This is the ancient world's athleisure wear, right? We want to make sure that we move well, right? So if you love your yoga pants, this is essentially like, put on your yoga pants, don't put on your pencil skirt, because you're not going to be able to move very well with that. You know, you need to be wearing the right kind of clothes when you eat this meal, because what's going to happen when the angel passes over? What's going to happen is the Israel's got to get out of town. The Israelites have got to leave. And so essentially, Passover is that moment where we're having a good meal that is meant to mark and acknowledge God's choice of us, but it's also meant to give us the strength and the energy to go. When the Israelites leave, they're not taking a road trip where they can pull off in an hour or two at the gas station and get a snack. That's not what's happening. They've got to be able to travel far distance. It is physically draining. They may not eat a big meal again for a while. And so this Passover meal is meant to really fill them up. And they cannot get comfortable. We've all had Thanksgiving dinner. What happens after Thanksgiving dinner? You have the glorious nap. I mean, you kind of have to have a moment where you're sort of like, oh, you're so full. No, God says you do not get that moment. You need to be ready to go. And so we see the specificity of how this meal is meant to be eaten in verse 11. There's also another interesting note in verse 12. Let's look at that one. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both humans and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. This is the one and only time where in the Bible there is an acknowledgement of the Egyptian gods. It's very interesting. Obviously, given that it's the one and only time the Egyptian gods are noted, it was not so critically important to the writer of Exodus that we reiterate the defeat of Egyptian gods. You will likely recall that I've mentioned multiple times this year that Exodus can be understood on one level as being a battle represented on earth between the gods in heaven. So in a sense, you've got Yahweh fighting against the Egyptian gods, and that is being represented by the people on earth. What's interesting is that this is the only moment when those Egyptian gods are actually named explicitly. And so in a sense, we could get at this idea in multiple different ways. What I think is most easy for us is to simply say, this 10th plague is the straw that breaks the back. This 10th plague is what really changes Pharaoh's mind, because this 10th plague is the one that breaks the Egyptian gods. And it's named very explicitly right here in verse 12. Lastly, when we think about what the Passover actually is, we've got that active moment, we've got Yahweh beating Egyptian gods and all of that. But what we see articulated here is that we're having a family meal. We know, I assume, that meat was not the staple of every meal in the ancient world. Meat is not the staple of every meal for most humans today. I love this story. So the first time I went to the Holy Land, we went over to Bethlehem, and in Bethlehem there is this fantastic restaurant that looks like a gigantic tent. And you sit in big tables with round booths, and I mean you can have a dozen people in each booth. And so what a lot of people will do is when they go over to the place that is called Shepherd's Field, which is where tradition holds that the shepherds were when the angels appeared to them and told them that Jesus was born, you kind of take a little tour of Shepherd's Field, you go to a chapel, it's all very pretty. Then everybody stops at this place for lunch. I can't remember what the place is called, but it's one of those brilliant Middle Eastern kind of restaurants where you sit down and they put this gigantic Lazy Susan, basically, of all kinds of pickled vegetables and hummus and baba ganoush, and you've got the pita and the olives and it's It's like everything you want. It makes my mouth water. And you just spin it around and you grab your pita and you eat and all that stuff. The first time I went to this restaurant, I was with a whole bunch of people I didn't know. I was by myself and I just met a group there and was taking this tour with them. And they were nice Americans from Pensacola. And as we were sitting around the table eating, about a half hour in, I, of course, am, delightfully gorging myself on all of these vegetables and hummus and everything. And the others are kind of picking, like an olive or maybe a little wedge of pita or something. Finally, one of them says, "When are we going to get lunch?" And I said, "This is lunch." And he said, "No, I mean like the rest of lunch." I said, "What is it that you're waiting for?" "Meat." And I said, "Oh no, you better eat this food because that's all you're getting for lunch." Like, there is no meat here. That is not what lunch is in this place. And in the ancient world, the idea that we'd have a lamb or a goat at the Passover meal is a luxury. It's real sustenance. And so we might see lamb, I keep saying lamb or goats because the word, if you look back at, what verse was it? There's a point at which it says, yes, verse 5, you said, "You may take it from the sheep or the goats." So you've got, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." And you might say, how are you going to get a lamb from the goats? Right? That's not how that works. Well, it's because the word they're using that is being translated as lamb is actually simply a general word that could mean lamb or goat, which is why we get that weird caveat there in verse 5. So when I say lamb or goat, it could be whatever. The fact that these families are having to sacrifice in this way is both expensive and luxurious and very sustaining. That meat will kind of stick with them and will be able to support them as they take that trip farther away. So back anyway to the structure of this is meant to be families, either your immediate family or your neighbor family. So what they say is if you don't have enough to go get yourself a lamb, then pair up with another family or even 3 families. Share this expensive moment so that the burden is not on any one family. And so families are gathering together to sit and have a meal. And the point of this meal is to create the identity of that family unit. This is not something you do on your own. This is something you do in community, family or friends. What I love about this is that it reminds me of what we do at Thanksgiving. I often say Thanksgiving's perhaps my favorite holiday, mostly because there's nothing else that you have to do. There are no parties and there are no gifts and you don't often do. The whole point is you get to sit at a table with your family and your friends, the people you love, and you share a meal. That's it. You don't have to do all the rest of the junk that all of the other holidays have. Passover really is anchored in that same kind of identity where you are giving thanks for being saved. And that's going to segue into our second section today, where we actually put Passover in historic and theological context. And so I'm going to pause there just to ask any questions about what has been laid out here in this Passover moment, phrasing that has been used, and then we're going to talk more Passover stuff. But do you have any questions about any of that before we move on? I know, I see you. All right, then let's keep going. We're going to put Passover into context, the impact that it has made over time. To do so, I'm going to go back to the first 2 verses of chapter 12. So let's look at verses 1 and 2. You may have noted I skipped them. Chapter 12, first 2 verses say, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, 'This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you.'" That's the way chapter 12 opens. I cannot overstate to you the importance of Passover for the Jewish people. There is nothing that is more important to a Jewish identity than this moment in time. Passover becomes the primary anchor for everything that the Jewish community becomes over centuries and centuries and generations. In this moment, Passover creates the identity of the people. And we have to go backwards to remember that the Israelites have been chosen. That chosenness is not supposed to be better than, although that sometimes that conflates in history. But the chosenness is, in a sense, a saving, a setting apart, a becoming somewhat special such that there is a task and a role to play in the world. That chosenness comes through Abraham, but it is not realized until this 10th plague. There's a promise made to Abraham that his descendants will number as great as the stars or the sands on the beach and yada, yada, yada. And the Israelites, in a sense, know that, but it's never become real to them. There was never much of action taken. Male circumcision, yes, but we all know that traditions can become mostly low impact over time if we don't constantly remember why they are important. And so it's likely that male circumcision just kind of became normal and it happened, and maybe you said a prayer, but it was not that big a deal. We remember chapters ago, Moses didn't even do that for his own son. So, that kind of took a back seat to much of what was going on in the world. In this moment with Passover, the Israelites are being reminded of that promise. They are renewing their responsibility in their own chosenness to do something in the world. And that's very important for us to note, because chosenness can be misunderstood as something one receives rather than something one owns and uses as a tool. The Jewish people were never meant to just be better than everyone else. The Jewish people were meant to have a task. They had a role. They had a job to play in the world. And given that we are Christian, it is okay for us to understand that part of Jesus' mission was a reminder to the Jewish people of the task they were asked to perform, which is essentially, God has given humanity a promise of salvation, a promise to be saved from pain and heartbreak and trouble, in a sense, saved from all of the horrible stuff in this world. And the Jewish people were called to bring everybody else into that reality, to bring everybody else into that promise. But for very intentional reasons, and one could argue good, reasonable things, the Jewish people kind of never became evangelical, in a sense. Christianity was fundamentally evangelical because Jesus was explicit. Like, the last thing Jesus said to his disciples, go make disciples of all nations. Not unclear. We are explicitly meant to go bring everybody in. That idea is not new. Judaism had as a component of their identity that call to bring everyone in. It just wasn't really happening. And today, even today, Judaism is not an evangelical tradition. Have I told y'all my favorite moment in Sex and the City? I said that back in the interfaith panel, I think, actually. If you remember back in 4 years ago when we did that first interfaith panel, my good, friends, my guests, gave this beautifully theological statement about something, and I recalled a scene from Sex and the City because, that's what I do. So there's this great scene where Charlotte York, meets her divorce attorney, who's a good Jew, and she falls in love with him despite herself, but he's not going to marry a Gentile, which I love that they say that. And so Charlotte, who was raised a good Episcopalian, put on her pearls and a skirt and made a basket of muffins and went down to the synagogue, and she knocked on the door of the rabbi's office, and the rabbi opened the office, with his glasses to here, and he's like this, opens the door, and Charlotte said, hello, I'm Charlotte York, and I'd like to be Jewish. And there's this long pause as the rabbi looks at her, and he says, we're not interested, and closes the door. And I just think, There's nothing better than that. Like the Episcopalian and the rabbi, I love it. And so that to me is sort of like, that's everything about Judaism. I mean, it was never something that was evangelical. This moment of the Passover is so critical to their identity that it becomes the anchor on which Jesus rests his entire mission. So if you think back to the moment when Jesus really sets forth his mission in the world, it is at a Passover dinner. The Last Supper is Passover. Jesus has gone to Jerusalem with his disciples, and they find a room in which they will share a meal, and that is the Passover Seder meal. And it's at that point that Jesus takes what has become so critical to the Jewish people and reforms it and remakes it and tries to explain its purpose in a more global sense. And what is so beautiful about that is we understand through the explicit actions of the Passover with the 10th plague, what God is actually trying to do in this moment of this Passover meal. God is actually trying to make very clear that he is saving the Jewish people. Now, we understand that, and the writers of Exodus understand that it is a literal, physical saving from being killed. We will see next week that as the angel of death passes over, the firstborn, humans and animals, all die. By responding to God with the blood and the lamb and the meal, the Jews are actually saved from dying. But see, here's the thing that Jesus does with that idea. Jesus twists this idea of being saved from physical death and creates an entire new theology around being saved actually from death itself. And so the early Christians take this idea of the angel passing over and they expand it such that when Jesus institutes the Last Supper, when Jesus institutes the new Passover, it's no longer just this temporal experience where we are alive, we will not be dead tomorrow. It's not just that. There is this sense that we will all die. Of course we will all die. But that then for us, because of God's love, is not the end. Death is simply the next step. Life is changed, not ended. And Passover, the identity of being saved from death, is what informs that entire growth of Christian theology from the first century on. I'll pause there to see if you've got any questions about that. I can say more about that, but I don't want to necessarily just ramble on. I've got a few just little notes about Passover as well. Any just immediate thoughts or reactions?
I had a sense from my Jewish friends that there was a more, rather than spreading it like we do evangelically, I had a sense more of keeping the blood pure. Now, we weren't going to date chicks. We were going to own a Jewish girl.
Yes. Are you just asking if that's a real thing? Okay. So the observation is, and I guess the question is, that there is a sense with some that one of the goals, I guess it's okay to say goals, I mean, sort of Judaism is essentially maintaining a good, pure bloodline. I think that's true for some. I think, though, that there is I cannot say there is any one way to be or understand Judaism in the same way that I can't say there's any one way to be or understand Christianity. There are plenty of different branches of Judaism who have very different understandings and practices and beliefs and all of those good things. Certainly there are some Jewish branches that want to maintain you can say bloodline. I mean, Judaism being Jewish is not because you choose to be a certain religion. Being Jewish is much more ethnicity and cultural identity. Interestingly, there are Christian groups around the world that really do that same thing. I don't know if I've ever said this to you all in here before, but being raised Catholic and being from a Catholic family that you would consider sort of like old world Catholic, I understand the sensibility around religion being ethnic or familial and not necessarily a choice, an individual choice. And I discovered that because I was in grad school and I was with a small group and I had been complaining about the Catholic Church like I had been for a while. And a good Episcopalian turned to me and said, if you don't like the Catholic Church, just go somewhere else. And it was great. She was like, shut up. But in that moment, I remember thinking, can I be something else? Isn't that so weird? I mean, I had grown up going to Methodist and Baptist youth groups and all. It's not as if I was in some kind of weird bubble. But it had not actually occurred to me, I could just be a different kind of Christian. How crazy is that? And so I get, truly, what that kind of ethnic, familial identity can really be around religion. Then, of course, we certainly know Episcopalians sort of fudge this, where you are or are not Episcopalian. Catholics do this all the time, where you may not go to church or do anything, but by God, you are going to have a baby baptized. Yes, you will. And your child will be confirmed, absolutely. And you will be buried, for sure. And you might not have been in this church for decades. You're going to be buried in that church. Why? I don't know. I want to say to some people, why does this matter to you? Because it obviously kind of doesn't matter to you, right? You haven't been here. And that's okay. It's not judgmental. It's just kind of rational. Either it matters or it doesn't matter. Because I promise you, and I say to people all the time with baptisms especially, this is not a box to check. Like, do not baptize because you're afraid of hell. Don't do that. Do it because you're starting on a path and you want to actually begin a journey that takes you deeper and changes you and transforms you. But old religious traditions often root themselves in those moments that essentially make people legitimate. Like, you are now legitimate because you have been baptized, or you are legitimate because you've been confirmed. No, that's so cheap. It can be so much better than that. But yes, there are many branches of Judaism, just like there are branches of Christianity, where the identity is sort of bloodline purity for sure. Judaism is not, essentially there are really no Jewish groups that are evangelical the way we think of evangelical. There are certainly Jewish groups that are very welcoming and hospitable for sure. Evangelical? Not so much. Now, you can say the same thing about Episcopalians, right? What's the old joke? Episcopal evangelism is painting the doors red and waiting for the right people to come up. So, we can be better than that. But not every Christian group is doing it that way. If I were to ask you all to raise your hand, how many of you have brought someone to church in the last couple months? I'm gonna go. Oh, show off. There you go. We got one hand in the room. But two. Oh, you both get credit? Is that what that is? Okay. Two people claim one person. That's good. I think we are not naturally that way either. Now, we are, what does it say? The Episcopal Church welcomes you, right? How many signs have you seen outside of Episcopal Church and you're thinking, good work? That's important. It's nice, but it's passively being nice. It does not take you that far. And we have hurdles that we as Episcopalians or many mainline Christians have that I would say many other traditions have, and Jews maybe, where we don't want to be offensive. We don't want to by inviting someone to come to church with us, A, what if they don't like it? That's vulnerable. And B, why are we inviting them to church? If we're trying to save their souls from burning forever in hell, okay, well, that's motivating, right? But if we're not really into fear theology, which I hope we are not, it's a different way of being to invite someone into an opportunity than it is to help keep someone from suffering. That's different. There's a reason politicians use fear all the time to motivate people. I mean, you go to, ready for this? How many people do we know in the world who would make great leaders, political leaders, but they can't win a primary? Well, why couldn't they win a primary? Well, it's because who votes in primaries? Mostly people who are at very polar ends of the political spectrum. And most of the people who are at polar ends of the political spectrum are, and I say this with a very big heart, being motivated primarily by fear. And it's fear of the other. And both sides do it. Fear works. I wish it didn't so well. It just does. Hopefulness and love and grace and the opportunity of being more than we are on our own, that just doesn't often motivate humans like fear does. We can be better than that. We cannot let fear control us, and we can let the opportunity of God actually guide and compel us. But we have to change our mindset, and that's hard. Any other thoughts or questions?
My wife's Greek Orthodox, and they're very similar to the Jews in terms of the cultural nature of the language. They teach the kids the language.
Oh yeah, so the observation is that one of our members here is married to a woman who is Greek Orthodox, and they do a lot of intentional training that is identity-based. I mean, I grew up in Florida. There are plenty of Jews in Florida, and the friends of mine there, they would go to what they call Jew school on Saturday mornings. I mean, it was, you go to synagogue or temple, you learn Hebrew. I mean, certainly when you do a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, one of the things, the central actions of that ceremony is you read from the scroll and you read in Hebrew. You have to know that language in order to essentially be a good Jew. You've probably heard me say this before, but I don't know if I've said it so explicitly recently. I think that for Christians in the future, and by the future I mean 20, 30 years from now, we actually need to now become much more like non-Christian religious groups. Jews, Muslims, you name it. Because one of the things they know is that America, writ large, cultural Americanism, is not going to teach anyone how to be Jewish or Muslim or anything else. Zero. Christians still, though, kind of think that being American will teach people how to be Christian. Y'all, that's so wrong. Woo! I mean, if we have not realized that in the last few years, like, we are way missing the boat. There is very little of our civic life that reflects Christianity anymore. If we do not take seriously actually training people to be Christian, and I'm talking our kids, they're not going to be. And we can kind of hang on with a few nice traditions, but they will miss what is so beautiful about our tradition if we do not show up and we do not train them. And I mean train them. I do not mean expose them nicely to some ideas at their convenience. No. We can see around here how serious people take music training and athletic training and academic training and all. Yes. Where's the religious training? Well, part of that rests on us. We are not actually taking it as seriously to provide the training here that the kids need. And so it's all of us actually doubling down and making that kind of investment, both sides, to train. Because it's not going to happen. By the way, it's not been happening. So it's not as if 2021 is some terrible pagan year. It's not been happening for generations, right? How many of you who have children Do your children actually go to church on Sundays most weeks? I bet very few. And how many of your children take your grandchildren to church on Sundays? I bet very few. And if you do, good job. Because I guarantee you the vast majority do not. Now, we have a lot of young families here who come every week. But it's interesting that most of those young families who are coming here were not raised here. They're not coming because their parents or their grandparents go to church here. They're coming because they want to go to church, and they've picked this one. The Episcopal Church has the worst retention rate of children born in the Episcopal Church than any mainline tradition. And yet, we have one of the highest, what's the word? I was going to say transition rates. That's not the right word. We have one of the highest, come on, when you become a different religion. Are you kidding me? Thank you. Conversion. Wow, that was great. We have one of the highest conversion rates. And it's interesting that the vast majority of people, I will just say here at St. Michael, who are converting to the Episcopal Church, to St. Michael, grew up in much more fundamental traditions, non-denominational, Baptist, you name it. And somewhere along the line, they really got that this stuff is real. They know the Bible. They believe that Jesus was doing real stuff, but they cannot justify the kind of exclusivism that they see in these other traditions. And so although they value and honor the very biblically literate way that they were raised, they actually became biblically literate. And they read Jesus. You cannot read the Gospels and exclude people. You can't. And people try, and they will jump through hoops. But the only way you exclude people in a Christian church is by not talking about Jesus. And so, I'll say that again. If you ever hear a Christian pastor preaching anything about excluding anybody, they are not preaching about Jesus. They are preaching Old Testament stuff, and they might be preaching a little bit of epistle stuff, but even that's hard to do. It's always Old Testament stuff. Well, in case you missed it, we have a New Testament. And so you can't anchor your actions on the old stuff if the new stuff says no. But that's a different sermon. So I'll stop there, or else someone will cut this and embarrass me somewhere. Okay. Other thoughts or questions? I know we've kind of reached the end, and I want to make sure you all get to your luncheon. Yes, one more.
I'll say one thing. My first husband was Jewish, and when he took me to meet the family, his mother took me to a back bedroom and said, "Listen, he is marrying a Jewish girl from New York, so just get ready."
Oh yeah.
We got married. She and I weren't friends for quite a few years.
So for those of you online, it's a good story of dating a Jewish boy and being told by his mother he's not going to marry you because you're not Jewish. It's amazing that I wonder why parents continue to think that telling their children who to marry is going to work. I'm not so sure that works most of the time, but people still try to do it. Anyway, glad to see you all today. Enjoy the luncheon if you're staying, and we'll be next week to plague number 10. Bye, guys.